you stop being endlessly available, the world rearranges itself around your boundaries. In Jungian terms, this is the moment the self rises above the mask of the persona. You withdraw misplaced energy, confront the shadow that fears rejection, and reclaim psychic authority. People who fed on your compliance feel the shift. Respect replaces convenience, silence replaces noise, and clarity replaces chaos. This is not selfishness, but individuation, the courage to become whole instead of useful. As you step back, unconscious patterns surface, revealing who values you and who only used you. Power returns, transforming relationships, identity, and destiny. When a person is always available, always responsive, always adjusting themselves to meet the expectations of others, something subtle begins to happen inside. They slowly confuse who they are with what they provide. Jung called this outer identity the persona, the social mask we wear to function in the world. It is useful, even necessary, but dangerous when it becomes the only face we live through. The moment you stop being endlessly accessible, that mask starts to loosen. The automatic smiling, the constant agreement, the silent endurance of discomfort, all of it begins to feel unnatural. Not because something is wrong, but because something real is finally trying to breathe. At first, this shift can feel uncomfortable. You may notice tension when you say no, hesitation when you don't rush to explain yourself, guilt when you prioritize your inner state over external approval. That discomfort is the psyche recalibrating. You are stepping out of a role that once kept you safe, accepted, or needed. When the persona weakens, the deeper personality starts to surface. The parts that were postponed, strained, or ignored in order to maintain harmony. This is not rebellion, it is alignment. You're no longer performing stability, kindness, or strength. You're embodying them from a grounded place. Interestingly, people around you will often react before you fully understand what's happening. Some will feel unsettled because the version of you they relied on is no longer predictable. Others may discover a new respect because your presence now carries clarity rather than accommodation. This shift exposes relational dynamics that were previously hidden under politeness and routine. You start seeing where connection was mutual and where it was merely convenient. Psychologically, this is a return of authority to the self. Energy that was scattered through obligation begins to consolidate inward. Thought becomes sharper, emotional reactions stabilize, decision-making gains weight. Instead of constantly adjusting to the outside world, the inner compass begins to guide behavior. Jung believed that true development requires this movement away from collective expectations toward personal integration. Without it, life becomes a loop of imitation rather than a process of becoming. Stopping your availability is not about withdrawal from humanity. It's about ending unconscious self-abandonment. It is the moment you choose authenticity over approval, presence over performance, direction over drift. And once that shift occurs, the way you relate to yourself and the world can never fully return to what it was. The mask may still exist, but it no longer leads the soul. When you begin pulling your availability back, something else quietly moves forward. The parts of you that stayed hidden while you were busy pleasing, fixing, accommodating, approving suddenly step into the light. Jung called this the shadow, not something evil, but everything the personality learned to suppress in order to remain accepted, safe, or admired. It includes anger that was never allowed to speak, needs that felt inconvenient, limits that once seemed dangerous, and desires that conflicted with the image you tried to maintain. As long as you stayed constantly open to others, these elements stayed buried, muted by routine and distraction. Once that constant outward movement slows, the psyche has space to surface what was postponed. You may notice irritation rising where patience used to live, sadness appearing where strength was rehearsed, or clarity replacing confusion you had normalized. This can feel unsettling because the mind prefers what is familiar, even when it quietly drains vitality. The shadow does not arrive gently. It often speaks through discomfort, resistance, or inner conflict. Yet this tension is not a problem to eliminate. It is information asking to be understood. Many people mistake this stage as becoming colder, selfish, or distant. In reality, it is the nervous system learning a new language. You're no longer operating purely from adaptation. You're developing self-recognition. When you acknowledge these hidden impulses instead of rejecting them, they integrate into consciousness rather than controlling behavior unconsciously. A person who accepts their assertiveness no longer explodes unexpectedly. Someone who admits vulnerability no longer seeks constant validation. What was once chaotic becomes organized through awareness. This integration creates psychological stability. Instead of splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts, you become whole. Decisions gain honesty. Relationships gain depth. Emotional responses carry proportion rather than excess. Stop projecting unresolved material onto others, reducing unnecessary conflict and misunderstanding. Jung believed this reconciliation between light and shadow is essential for maturity, because a fragmented self cannot sustain inner authority or genuine freedom. With this shift, your inner world becomes less reactive and more intentional. You recognize your motivations instead of being driven by them. You listen inward without fear of what might surface. The personality becomes grounded rather than performative. And slowly, the need to constantly explain, justify, or seek permission dissolves. This is not about becoming hardened or detached from connection. It's about standing in truthful alignment with the full range of your human nature. When you stop running from the parts you once hid, you stop being ruled by them. Integration doesn't make life perfect, it makes it real. As this inner integration stabilizes, another shift becomes noticeable. Your energy begins to return to you. For a long time, much of your psychological force was invested outward, scattered across obligations, expectations, emotional labor, and unconscious roles you felt compelled to maintain. Availability seems harmless on the surface, yet it quietly fragments attention, intention, and vitality. Each small compliance may feel insignificant, but together they form a pattern of continuous self-export. The psyche was never designed to operate in permanent dispersion. It requires periods of withdrawal to reorganize, restore, and strengthen its center. When you create space, the nervous system slows its constant vigilance. Thought becomes less reactive and more deliberate. You begin sensing where effort is meaningful rather than automatic. This is not laziness or avoidance. It is psychological conservation. Jung viewed energy not merely as physical stamina, but as psychic currency. What you invest shapes who you become. When that currency stops leaking into every external demand, it gathers inward and strengthens personal direction. This reclaimed vitality often expresses itself as clarity. Decisions no longer feel rushed or pressured by outside noise. Emotional boundaries become easier to sense because the inner signal is no longer drowned by obligation. Even creativity and curiosity tend to return, not as forced productivity, but as natural movement of a rested mind. You begin responding instead of reacting. T here is a noticeable steadiness in how you meet challenges, because your inner reserves are no longer depleted by constant accessibility. People sometimes fear that conserving energy will make them disconnected or less generous. Yet the opposite often occurs. When your inner resources are stable, engagement becomes intentional rather than compulsive. You offer presence instead of obligation. Support becomes authentic instead of draining. Relationships improve not through constant availability, but through grounded participation. Others sense the difference. Your attention carries weight because it is no longer scattered. Psychologically, this marks the restoration of internal sovereignty. You are no longer borrowing identity from usefulness or approval. Your sense of worth begins to root itself in self-awareness rather than external response. This is a quiet but profound shift. You don't need to announce it. It expresses itself through calm, consistency, and discernment. Life feels less like a constant negotiation and more like a deliberate unfolding. When energy returns to its rightful place, the mind regains its natural rhythm. You move with intention instead of pressure, clarity instead of compulsion. And from that centered state, real strength becomes sustainable rather than exhausting. Power grows where presence is protected. As this inner strength stabilizes, something deeper begins to unfold, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a quiet realignment of identity. Jung described this movement as individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are beneath conditioning, roles, and inherited expectations. When you stop being endlessly available, you stop orbiting the needs and projections of others. Your psychological center slowly shifts inward. Instead of asking, "What do I need to be for the world?" the mind begins asking, "What is asking to emerge through me?" This change often feels subtle at first. You may notice that certain choices no longer feel negotiable, values sharpen, preferences gain confidence. The internal voice becomes clearer, less distorted by fear of disapproval or the pressure to remain liked. You start recognizing where past decisions were shaped more by survival patterns than by genuine alignment. What once felt normal may begin to feel misaligned, and what once felt risky may suddenly feel necessary. Individuation is not about isolation or rebellion against society. It is about integration, bringing unconscious tendencies into awareness so that life is guided by intention rather than habit. The personality becomes less reactive, less driven by compensation or validation. You begin acting from inner coherence instead of social momentum. This often changes how you relate to ambition, success, relationships, and even time itself. There is less urgency to prove, impress, or chase. Direction replaces pressure. Many people resist this phase because it requires tolerating uncertainty. When old identities dissolve, the future cannot be fully scripted. Yet this uncertainty is not emptiness, it is fertile ground. It allows authenticity to replace imitation. Instead of repeating patterns inherited from family, culture, or past adaptation, you begin shaping your own psychological architecture. The self becomes an active participant in its own evolution rather than a passive product of circumstance. This maturation also strengthens responsibility. You become accountable not only for what you do, but for who you are demonstrating in the world. Actions carry integrity because they emerge from internal consistency rather than external reward. This creates a quiet confidence, not loud or performative, but steady and grounded. You no longer need to constantly explain yourself, because your life begins to speak on your behalf. Jung believed that a person who does not individuate remains fragmented, pulled by collective expectations rather than inner truth. But when this process activates, life gains depth, meaning, and psychological dignity. You stop living as a reflection of others and start living as a coherent whole. When you become aligned with your inner direction, the world no longer defines you, it responds to you. As this inner alignment deepens, it inevitably reshapes the way your relationships function. When you stop being constantly available, the unspoken agreements that once governed your interactions begin to change. For a long time, certain dynamics may have relied on your predictability, your readiness to accommodate, to rescue, to absorb emotional weight, or to remain silent when something felt wrong. These patterns often develop quietly, not through manipulation alone, but through repetition and unconscious expectation. Once you alter your participation, the structure itself must respond. Some connections adapt with surprising maturity. When boundaries become clear, mutual respect often grows. Conversations become more honest because neither side is operating from quiet resentment or invisible obligation. You may notice that your presence carries greater impact simply because it is no longer automatic. Time together becomes intentional rather than habitual. This shift allows genuine closeness to emerge instead of dependency disguised as loyalty. Other relationships, however, may strain or fade. This is not necessarily failure, it is information. When a bond depends primarily on access, convenience, or emotional extraction, it struggles to survive authenticity. Resistance may appear in subtle ways: guilt, misunderstanding, passive pressure, or emotional withdrawal. These reactions reveal where the connection was built on imbalance rather than reciprocity. While this can feel uncomfortable, it also brings clarity. You begin seeing who engages with your essence and who only benefited from your availability. Psychologically, this rebalancing reduces unconscious entanglement. You are no longer regulating other people's stability at the cost of your own. Emotional responsibility returns to its rightful place. This doesn't eliminate care or compassion, refines them. You support without self-erasure. You listen without absorbing. You participate without losing your center. This creates healthier relational boundaries, where individuality and connection coexist rather than compete. Over time, your social environment reorganizes itself around this new equilibrium. Some bonds deepen through mutual growth. Others dissolve naturally, making space for alignment that matches your evolving self. There is less drama, less negotiation of worth, less silent endurance. Communication becomes simpler because expectations are no longer distorted by unspoken sacrifice. Jung understood that relationships often mirror the inner state of the psyche. As the inner structure becomes integrated and self-directed, external connections reflect that order. You attract dynamics that respect autonomy rather than dependence. You engage from presence rather than need. The quality of interaction improves because it arises from wholeness instead of compensation. When relationships no longer require you to abandon yourself, connection becomes a choice, not a survival strategy. And from that grounded space, true intimacy finally has room to exist. As relationships stabilize and external noise quiets, something even more fundamental begins to activate a sense of inner authority. This is not dominance over others, nor rigid control of life. It is the quiet confidence that your decisions are rooted in self-trust rather than fear, approval, or habit. When you stop being endlessly available, you stop outsourcing your direction. The psyche reclaims its role as the primary guide. For many people, identity has been shaped by reaction. They move according to expectations, emotional pressure, cultural scripts, or the need to remain needed. Over time, this creates a subtle dependence on external validation. Choices feel uncertain unless mirrored by reassurance. Boundaries feel dangerous because they threaten belonging. When availability decreases, that dependency is exposed. At first, the absence of constant feedback can feel disorienting, even lonely. Yet this space is where inner authority is born. Gradually, you begin trusting your internal signals. You recognize when something aligns or conflicts without needing permission to feel it. Decisions carry weight because they emerge from clarity instead of impulse. You no longer explain yourself excessively or negotiate your inner truth to remain comfortable for others. This strengthens psychological posture. You stand more firmly in your values, not because they are defended, but because they are embodied. Jung understood that maturity requires this internal governance. Without it, the individual remains psychologically dependent, pulled by unconscious forces and collective expectation. With it, life becomes guided rather than reactive. The mind organizes itself around coherence. Emotional responses become proportional rather than exaggerated. Even uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate because it is navigated from inner stability rather than external reassurance. This self-authority also deepens responsibility. You begin recognizing that your life is shaped less by circumstance than by how consciously you respond to it. Blame loses its appeal. Victimhood dissolves into agency. You stop waiting for permission to evolve, to rest, to change direction, or to protect your energy. The center of gravity shifts inward, where genuine confidence quietly forms. Importantly, this does not create rigidity or isolation. It creates discernment. You can remain open without being porous, engaged without being absorbed, generous without self-erasure. Influence flows outward naturally when inner alignment is strong. Others sense the steadiness in your presence, not because you assert control, but because you no longer surrender it unconsciously. Over time, life begins to feel less chaotic and more intentional. You move with direction rather than pressure. Choices feel honest rather than defensive. The inner world becomes ordered not through force but through awareness. This is the psychological dignity Jung spoke of, a self that stands grounded within itself. When authority returns to the inner core, you stop seeking permission to be whole and begin living as if you already are.